So, good afternoon. It sounds like we still have a number of people in the hallway, so we'll just wait a couple more minutes for a few last people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon. It looks like everyone's pretty much getting settled. We have a few people still looking for their seats. But while they're doing that, I think we can get started because we do have a very, very full agenda today. So good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today, for coming out today, or even just for watching today's program management review. It's a very, very exciting milestone for us as we roll out the operational plan for the 2020 census. We have an absolutely awesome day ahead of us, afternoon ahead of us, so I would like to start with some of the housekeeping items, and then we'll move on into the meat of our presentation. So just a few of that, there we go. So just a few of the housekeeping items that many of you are familiar with as you've attended our program management reviews many times before. The first is, I would just remind you that the meeting is being broadcast via a publicly available web broadcast. You need to consider as you're having conversations in the room that while your mic may be off, the room is actually mic'd. So anything you say can be, or potentially can be picked up. So we do just remind you about that. Also, there are some legal requirements that we have to follow when we are working with contractors or with potential contractors. And for that, I'd actually like to turn it over to Mike Polensky, who's just going to give us a few words.
So hi, Lisa. Since we have a lot of contractors, we have government, we're webcasting it. It's live for the most part. Everybody can see it. Please refrain from having conversations on information that is not publicly available. Okay, there are contractors, people who need to know. So there's a lot of conversations. There's incumbents in our offices throughout the Census Bureau. So just please refrain and stick to what is publicly available. So when we release something like this, this is publicly available. You can talk about that. But you can't release any other details beyond what's publicly available, okay, to keep that level playing field. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Mike. For questions, when we do get to question and answers, we have allowed for ample time in all of the discussions today to allow for questions. Please do turn your microphones on. You need to push the little button to do that. Please state your name and your affiliation so that those of us in the room know who's asking the question as well as those who are watching via webcast. I'd also remind you where the restrooms are. The restrooms are out the doors and back that way and then to your right. There are also some along the main hallway to the left. And in the case of an emergency, while we don't expect that there will be an emergency, we do have an emergency exit over here. And as well, if you go out the doors, the emergency exits are right out there as well. Again, as I said, for questions, Q&A is encouraged. We do only have a few hours this afternoon, and we have a lot to cover. So some of the questions we may table to answer offline. And of course, we do encourage you to email us at 2020.census.pmr@census.gov. And of course, we'll collect all of those questions and respond appropriately. With that, what I'd like to do is go over what today's agenda is. Today we're going to do some very brief updates. I promise to keep this welcome to as short a time period as I possibly can, but a few brief updates on the overall health of the program. Mostly what I'd like to do is to introduce you all to some of our new, or in some cases newer, faces in the room. We've been very successful in bringing on staff to help us with the 2020 program. We'll then spend the bulk of the afternoon in a panel presentation, as you see, on the design of the 2020 census. After we conclude the discussion about the design of the 2020 census, Shireen will then lead us through the remainder of the afternoon and focusing on our current operations. We'll do a quick update on our current national content test that's underway right now, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of our testing plans for 2016. So as you all know, over the past couple of years, I've talked a lot about the Decennial Directorate's reorganization and where we were in the reorganization and how far along we were and what that would mean for us as an organization. A couple PMRs ago, we were able to tell you that reorganization was approved, but we still had a lot of vacancies. Today, I can tell you that we're actively working on filling many of those vacancies, and I'd like to take just a moment to introduce you to just a few of the new members of our management team. I think we've met Shireen at the last, perhaps 2 program management reviews. I'm pleased to say that she is here working with us, and she's helped us all in more ways than we can even begin to count in getting our programs underway, keeping our operations on track, and really bringing the 2020 census into the next level. I'd also announce Carol Brady. I'm not sure if she's in the room. If she is, she can stand. And actually, for all of the people that I am, if you'd like to stand when I recognize you, that would be great so people can put a face with a name. But Carol is our new chief of the Configuration, Release, and SDLC Management Branch in our Information Technology Division. Jessica was introduced, I believe, at the last program management review, and actually she is out on travel right now, heading out to the first of our tribal consultations. Samanika Green is back with the 2020 program, and she is in the room. Welcome back, Samanika. I believe she just started with us this week, so we're glad to have her back. Julie Grossman, I didn't see Julie when I came in. Julie is one of our new chiefs of our Geocoding Systems branch in our Information Technology Division. Alexa Jones-Putoff, who I did see. Welcome, Alexa. Welcome back to the Census Bureau. Alexa is our new Assistant Division Chief for Infrastructure in our Decennial Census Management Division. Atri Kalori, I know Atri's back there. Atri is our new Division Chief for our Decennial Information Technology Division. I didn't see Maria when I came in the room. Maria, are you in here? Maria Malagon? Okay, I'd like to welcome Maria back to the Decennial Directorate. Maria is our new Assistant Division Chief for Management and Data User Education in our American Community Survey Office. And Jackie, I don't think she's in the room as well. Jackie, also with the American Community Survey Office, is our new Chief of the Data Processing Coordination Branch. Darlene Richards, I didn't see her come in, welcoming her back to the Decennial Directorate. She is our Deputy Program Manager for the Center for Enterprise Dissemination Services and Consumer Innovation. Lisa Thompson. Lisa Thompson has taken a new role within the Decennial Directorate. She's our Chief of our Decennial SharePoint Administration Branch in our Information Technology Division. Darlene Arcidi. Nope, Darlene's not here as well. Darlene is the Chief of our Decennial Directorate Support Services Office. Ceci Villarross, who's over there. Ceci, welcome back to the program. Ceci is our new branch chief of our Stakeholder Relations staff in the Decennial Communications Coordination Office. And the last announcement I would make is James Whitehorn, and I don't think James is here either. James is the chief of our Redistricting and Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. So with that, I wanted to highlight just a couple of other things. As we all know, as we're doing our updates, in terms of the budget for the 2020 census program, we are currently operating under a continuing resolution in FY16, as we all are, and budget and timing of the funding continue to be red risks for the program as we enter into fiscal year 16. I did want to point out before we got into the meat of today that we do have a number of major milestones to occur in fiscal year 16. Of course, we have our 2016 census test, which Shireen will be talking about later today. We have our 2016 address canvassing test, which will occur at the end of fiscal year 16, heading into fiscal year 17. We're in the process now of conducting the CEDCAP analysis of alternatives, which will help us better understand our capabilities and where we are going with our CEDCAP systems. We also plan to award our Census Questionnaire Assistance contract in fiscal year 16. If funding permits, we plan to award our Integrated Communication and Partnership contract. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, just this week we're kicking off our tribal consultations. Those are just a number of the many activities that we actually have underway right now in fiscal year 16. And with that, just as a brief introduction, what I'd like to do, and I am right on schedule, is move us straight into the rollout of the 2020 Census Operational Plan. Unless there are any questions about the program introduction? And do we have anyone in the overflow room? There. I'm thinking we don't right now because the room's still pretty full. Okay, so with that, we're going to jump right in. So what I'd like to do now is turn into the meat of today's presentation, the substance of today's presentation, the design of the 2020 census, and the development of the operational plan. While there are just a few of us sitting up here today giving the main presentation, I really do think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that the development of the operational plan has truly been a collective effort. And I'd like to pause now and just briefly thank and acknowledge all of those in the program that made this happen. At the conclusion of the discussion of the operational plan, I'm going to return to this, but I'd actually like to start with just a few recognitions now. First of all, I'd like to start by recognizing the senior leadership of the Decennial Directorate, starting with Shireen. I saw Deb Stempowski in the back of the room. Tim Traynor is out on travel. Pat Cantwell, Deirdre Bishop, Atri Kalori. Without their help, without their assistance, the operational plan that we're releasing today, that we're rolling out today, would not have been able to be prepared in the time period that we have. I also would like to pause and acknowledge the regional directors who are also here with us today. Fernando Armstrong, Jeff Baylor, Jamie Christie. Al Fontenot is not, I believe, he's out on travel heading to the tribal consultations, but George Grandy is over there sitting next to Kathy Lacey. And of course, Dave Hackbarth, who I saw, where did he go? Oh, he's over there now. And Dave Hackbarth. Over the last few months, we've spent a considerable amount of time really working with the regional directors as we were developing the operational plan, talking through the implications of some of the design decisions. And because of their help and their attention to this and our ability to work collectively, we have a much, much stronger program, and I thank them for that. Lastly, I wanted to thank the Census Bureau's, not lastly, but lastly for this part, I wanted to thank the Census Bureau Senior Leadership Team, our Executive Steering Committee. John Thompson, Nancy Potok, Joanne Crane, Enrique Lamas, Harry Lee, Tom Lewis, Tim Olson, and Jeannie Schiffer. As we've progressed throughout the year with our Executive Steering Committee, our updates, our discussions about the methodology, the decisions we were making, the feedback we got, all of that contributed to making a much stronger plan. And I would like to take a moment to thank all of these people for helping us build the plan we have today. So please join me in recognizing everyone. So with that, let me jump into the presentation itself and the design of the census. Today's discussion, as you all know, reflects the culmination of years of research and testing. And we are so excited to be here today to be able to roll out the operational plan and the design of the 2020 census. I think it's really important as we begin this discussion to set the stage. And as we set the stage, it's really important to remember where we are in the life cycle of the 2020 census and where we need to go with that life cycle. We are still 5 years out from the actual execution of the census. And as it would be expected, because we are 5 years out, we don't have all the answers to all the questions that we might need for the entirety of the census today. What we do have today are all of the answers to the questions that we must answer today. And in addition to knowing the answers to the questions that we need to know today, we now know and have documented when we will need to have and what those questions are that we need to answer the remainder. And that's what's most important about where we are today. So let me start with the bottom line as we begin. Due to everyone's hard work, the amazing tests that we've concluded, the creativity and innovation in our methodologies, the 2020 census is estimated to cost $12.5 billion, compared with the cost of repeating the design of the 2010 census of $17.8 billion. This represents $5.2 billion in cost avoidance for the 2020 census. Another way to look at this is that the 2020 census, if executed the way we have designed it today, will realize a lower cost per housing unit than the 2010 census. The 2010 census estimated cost per housing unit would have been $124 per housing unit. Our design today has an estimated cost of $88 per housing unit. So why do we do this? Why do we conduct the census? I know for most of you this is well familiar information, but for the benefit of all, let me provide just some brief background on why we actually take the decennial census. Our purpose is to conduct a census of population and housing and disseminate the results to the President, the states, and the American people. The census data that we collect are used for a whole variety of purposes. For the purpose of today's discussion, I'll focus just on two. The first purpose that I'll focus on is that by December 31st of 2020, within 9 months of Census Day, we must provide the counts for apportionment. And that is a date that we cannot miss and we will not miss. The second purpose that I will highlight for today is that within 1 year of Census Day, by March 31st of 2021, we must provide the data for redistricting. Again, these are legislated mandates that we will make, and it helps us understand the context in which we take the decennial census. As we look to plan the census, one of the things we think about, in addition to our two main deliverables that we put out, is the environment that we'll actually be taking the census in during the time we're conducting it. In the spirit of time today, I'm not going to talk about each and every one of these bubbles or all of the constraints or the conditions that we think we'll be operating under, but I do want to highlight just a few because I think it helps explain some of the components of our design. The first that I would point out is that of a constrained fiscal environment. I highlight this one because most of the time when people hear a constrained fiscal environment, they think about one thing. They think about, does that mean, will we have the budget we expect to have to allow us to execute the program the way we've planned it? I highlight this one because we do mean that, but in addition to talking about a constrained fiscal environment in that sense, we also, in the course of planning a census, have to think about a fiscal environment in a very different sense. And that is one that we can't control and we can't influence. And that means, what will the economy look like in 2020? We need to consider what the economy will look like because it affects our ability to hire the skilled workforce that we need at the point in which we need it. And that's an important consideration for us as we plan the design of the census. I also would point out a couple of other considerations as we look to the design of the census. The next would be declining response rates. We all know, working in social science, that response rates to all surveys and censuses have been declining over the last few years. People are overwhelmed with information. They're worried about privacy. They're worried about confidentiality. They're worried about sharing their information. And they're bombarded with those requests. This is the environment we work in today. This is the environment that we set out, that we must count each and every person once and only once and in the right place. In order to do that, we have to think about this within the design that we lay out. This, combined with an increasingly diverse population, makes it even more challenging for us. We know that the demographic and cultural makeup of the United States has changed. We know that it's gotten more complex. We know that the number of people that don't speak English as a first language has grown. Those factors have implications for our census design. We know that the United States is a very mobile population. Data from the American Community Survey tell us that 12% of the population move in any given year. Yet we're taking the census in a very short period of time, and as I've said already, our goal is to count everyone once and only once and in the right place. So as we attempt to do that, as we look toward that future, as we look toward implementing the census and think about how we're going to achieve that overarching goal, for this census we combined it with an additional challenge goal. That goal of conducting the 2020 census at a lower cost per household adjusted for inflation than the 2010 census, while still maintaining our commitment to high quality results. So how did we set about doing this? For those of you that haven't been with us on our journey over the last few years, how did we do it? Well, we stepped back and said, what are the major cost drivers for this census? What are the key areas that we need to look at first to innovate, to re-engineer, to bring the cost of the census down? How can we introduce new methodologies, and how can we move this census forward? When we did that, we identified 4 key innovation areas: re-engineering address canvassing, optimizing self-response, utilizing administrative records and third-party data, and re-engineering field operations. What I'd like to do now for the next few minutes is really talk through each and every one of those 4 innovation areas, and I'll talk with you about how we're re-engineering those areas and introducing innovation. When I complete that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Deirdre, who's going to walk us through the operational plan and the decisions that we've made to date. So starting with re-engineering address canvassing. The goal for re-engineering address canvassing is to reduce the nationwide in-field address canvassing by developing innovative methodologies for updating and maintaining the Census Bureau's address list throughout the decade. So as we thought about re-engineering address canvassing, what did we decide we will do? We decided that we will continue to canvass the entire nation. We're simply going to canvass the nation differently. So how are we going to do that? What does a re-engineered address canvassing operation look like? What does it mean to canvass the entire nation but to do it differently? For us, it means developing an operation that consists of at least 3 components with quality infused throughout. The first component would be our in-office address canvassing, and I'll talk more about each of these in a second. The second component of our re-engineered address canvassing would be our effort to conduct a limited amount of in-field canvassing or in-field verification. And the third component of our re-engineered address canvassing is implementing a MAF coverage study that will occur on an annual basis. So let me talk you through what this means as we look toward the census design. When we look toward 2020 and we think about what our need is for 2020 to actually execute the census, we first start by thinking about what will the universe look like? How many addresses will we have to enumerate in 2020? What does our frame look like? So we start with a projected number of 143 million housing units in the United States and Puerto Rico. This becomes the basis for everything we're going to do with the census, nearly 143 million housing units. We then begin our procedures to conduct in-office address canvassing. We are going to complete a 100% verification, a 100% address canvass of the entire nation through our in-office techniques. Just about a month ago now, I was down at our National Processing Center visiting with Dave and with the regional directors, and we went down about a half day early, so we were able to see the setup for our in-office address canvassing. And they have a room, gosh, probably about this size, where they've set up the 60 desks for our in-office canvassers, where they will be doing the in-office canvass. We were able to spend that afternoon talking with the supervisors, looking at the technology, looking at the imagery, exactly seeing what it is our staff will be doing as they complete this in-office review. Our in-office address canvassing is underway right now with a very small group of staff that will continue to grow as we enter this fiscal year to its full level. But as I said, we're going to complete a 100% in-office review. Based on our 100% in-office review, we know that there are elements of the country, there are parts of the country that will require some sort of in-field verification. Based on the research and testing we've done to date, based on the results of the address validation test, based on the results of our own review of imagery, based on what we know from the delivery sequence file and other administrative and third-party data, we estimate that about 25% of the addresses will require some sort of in-field verification. Now, why do we estimate that we'll need to do some in-field verification? It's really simple, and it's actually not, but I'll try to keep it really simple from a couple of examples. Evan can help us complicate it later. No, it's all good. So first, if we think about a large urban area, for example, where there may be large apartment buildings, we have address information about that apartment building. We know it exists. If we look at 2 vintages of imagery, we can see there's an apartment building in one and an apartment building in the other. What we can't see is what's occurring under the roof. We can't see if there have been additional units that have been subdivided. We can't see the number. We may get some information from some administrative records or some third-party data, but this to us might require in-field verification. Another example where we may need in-field verification might be in a very rural area where there's a lot of tree foliage, where our imagery doesn't allow us to see below the tree line. There again, we may require some in-field verification. Again, based on the information we have to date, the research and testing that we have accomplished, we believe we can limit this in-field verification to about 25% of the addresses. The third component of our re-engineered address canvassing is what we're today calling a MAF coverage study. This is a very critical component of our ability to understand and assess the quality and coverage of the master address file. What we will be doing starting in fiscal year 16 on an annual basis is taking a sample of 20,000 blocks per year and conducting a listing operation of those blocks. The information from this MAF coverage study will allow us to assess and understand the coverage and the quality of our address frame. This is very important to us because as we progress throughout the decade, we need this additional verification, this additional benchmark to help us understand where we are today and where we need to get to in time for the census. Okay. Moving on to our next innovation area, that of optimizing self-response. Our goal for optimizing self-response is to generate the largest possible self-response, reducing the number of households that require follow-up. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to engage and motivate the population to respond and to participate in the 2020 census? In order to do this, we must make it easy for them to respond anytime and anywhere. Our goal, again, is to get as many people as possible to be engaged and motivated and to respond to the census. We're going to do this through a combination of things: a nationwide advertising and partnership campaign, the use of tailored contact strategies, and the use of non-ID processing. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by non-ID processing. We haven't found a good way to explain it that's not technical, so I find a brief pause and an explanation helps. So, generally, when we send out census and surveys to our respondents, we include either a 9, an 11, a 14-digit identification number. That's a unique code that when our respondents log into our Centurion or our web collection instrument, they first enter that code. That identification number links that respondent's address back to the information we have in our master address file. For this census, we're looking to deploy, and we did test this in our 2015 test and was very successful, the ability for some people to respond without a census identification number. Why do we want to do this, you might wonder? Because it allows us to make the census mobile. It allows us to take a program that we've traditionally run during the census, like Be Counted, and use it throughout the entirety of the census. It allows us to go into small geographic areas, to interact with small demographic groups, and say in those audiences, stand up and be counted. And for this census, it allows us to say, stand up and be counted. Now, don't go home to be counted. We want to help you do that right here, right now. Please come over right here, and we have a kiosk set up or a computer set up where you can fill out your census form now. We want to help you do this. The ability to use non-ID processing and to bring the census into communities in real time allows us to increase that self-response rate, reducing the follow-up that we will have to do in person. With that all said as background, we believe that this will be a very small percent of the population, the respondents, that will actually use non-ID processing. Our testing to date have shown us that most people will respond with the census ID. And for all of our tailored communication messages that we're planning to send out, all of the invitation letters, we're intending to include that identification number on them. So let's talk about how we're going to accomplish our self-response, how we're going to specifically engage and motivate people. Again, there are a number of components, 4 different components that we're looking at that make up the entirety of our ability to innovate and optimize self-response. The first, as I said, is an integrated partnership and communications campaign. We're very excited about this because it's a very unique way, as we saw in the 2015 test in the Savannah media market, for us to tailor our messages and our partnership program to the local communities and try to encourage the response to come in that way. In addition to that, we're also looking to use our mailed invitation letters. And here we're really looking at a tailored contact strategy for our respondents. We intend to invite the population to self-respond using the internet, a very important part for the 2020 census, but one difference we're planning to implement for the 2020 census as compared with previous censuses is for this census we will be using a staggered mail approach. For those of you that have been around the census before, you'll recall in past censuses it was very important to us to have all of our in-home materials arrive on the same day so that people understood that, and we tied it very closely with our communications campaign. For this census, in order to help us manage the workload, we're going to deploy what we're looking at is about a 7-day approach right now, staggered mailing. This will help us manage the call volumes as well as the workload that will come in as a result of that initial mailing. In addition to using a staggered mailing, for the vast majority of addresses, that first piece of mail that they will receive will simply be an invitation to respond using the internet. But for up to about 20% of the addresses, we do intend to include a questionnaire in the first mailing. Now you may be wondering, why are we planning to include a questionnaire in the first mailing if we're moving to an internet-based census? Because our research and testing have shown us that there's a large demographic group, particularly the population over about the age of 65, in areas where there's low internet accessibility, that when they receive our invitation letters, as we saw in the 14 test, as we saw in the 15 test, as we're currently seeing in the American Community Survey, the first thing they do is pick up the phone and call for assistance. They either don't have access to the internet or they don't want to use their internet to fill fill out our census or our survey form. By including a questionnaire in the first mailing, these are people that want to respond, they want to participate. By including a questionnaire in the first mailing, we're giving them that opportunity to do so, and we're hopefully balancing our workload so that we can better manage it as well. We're currently testing this approach in the National Content Test. One of our panels is what we call the Internet Choice Panel. The data are still coming in, but the preliminary data seem to show that this is a very helpful strategy for us. After we move from our first mailing, we're going to have several other mailings. I should say for this census, for the sake of time, there is the possibility of an address receiving up to 6 mailings. I also would like to point out that we're continuing to refine our mailing and testing strategy in our national content test, as well as in our testing plan for 2016. I'll talk a little bit about the 5th and 6th mailings. The rest of the mailings numbers 2 through 4, are really our reminders, and depending at which panel you're in or at which point in time when the questionnaire would be mailed. The 5th mailing that we're looking at doing it right now is another innovation area, and it's also something that we're currently testing in the National Content Test. This would be an additional reminder postcard to addresses that have not responded. Generally, we've stopped with 4. In our National Content Test, we are testing a 5th postcard mailing to see if we can get some late self-response in through the addition of this 5th mailing. Part of our innovation behind this, our idea for including it, really came about as a result of our 2015 test in the Savannah media market, where we were able to test 1 postcard among 30,000 addresses, and we did receive an 8% response from that. So we believe that the mail does have some promise for us here. I'll hold off on talking about the 6 mailings till I talk about our approach for non-response follow-up, because the 6 mailings are directly tied to what we'd implement there. I've already talked with you about the 3rd component of optimizing self-response, and that's our ability to use non-ID processing. Again, as I said earlier, we estimate that of the 143 million addresses, only about 10% of those addresses would actually respond via non-ID processing, but we do believe it to be a very promising way to reach communities, particularly those hard to count. The last component of our ability to optimize self-response is our census questionnaire assistance. This will be a contracted solution for us, as it was in 2010, but it is a way for our respondents to interact with our telephone centers. We're currently estimating that about 15% of all the housing units will call with some question, generating inbound calls to us, and we expect to be able to do this in multiple languages. One of the changes that we're implementing for the 2020 census compared with the 2010 census is that we expect our census questionnaire assistance lines to actually take respondents' questionnaires over the phone. During the 2010 census, when people called with questions, we served as a question and answer, FAQ kind of place. We facilitated those questions, we directed them to where the information was. What we've learned as the Census Bureau has moved to using the internet for more and more of its data collections is that when people are calling our questionnaire assistance lines, they're actually sometimes, frequently, calling with questions about technology. They're calling because their browser isn't displaying something appropriately or the form isn't populating. For the purpose of the census, rather than getting bogged down in answering those technical questions, we will have our agents simply quickly pivot and take that response over the telephone. And this is a change for us from the 2010 census. Lastly, before I move off of optimizing self-response, I wanted to share with you, based on what our research and testing have told us to date, what we believe our preliminary self-response rates to be. So our preliminary estimated self-response rates after 6 weeks of data collection, and 6 weeks is very important to us because it reflects where we need to be when we do our first cut for non-response follow-up, is that we're predicting that we will have about a 63.5 self-response rate at that point in time. About 47% of that will come in through the internet, about 5.3% will come in through our census questionnaire assistance line, and about 11.2% will come in via paper. With that as background, what I'd like to do now is talk briefly about our plans and our decisions around utilizing administrative records and third-party data. As I talk about this, I probably, just for your own knowledge, I probably will veer a little bit into re-engineering field operations because the two of these innovation areas really go hand in hand and really speak to how we're planning to re-engineer our non-response follow-up operations. But first and foremost, let me talk about utilizing administrative records and third-party data. Our goal with this innovation area is to use information people have already provided to reduce the expensive in-person follow-up. For those who have not responded, the Census Bureau will use the most cost-effective strategy for contacting and counting people. But let me be very clear about this. This is not an administrative record census. This is a census where we will use administrative records where the use of those records makes sense. Where the use of those records do not make sense, we will use other alternatives. And the use of administrative records, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, allows us to focus those needed resources in the areas where we need to put it. It allows us to spend the time, the energy, and the resources to help us ensure a complete and accurate coverage for all demographic groups. So how are we intending to use administrative records for this census? We're intending to use administrative records and third-party data to help us reduce the number of visits by using available data from government administrative records and third-party sources. We will use them to help us identify vacant households. We will use them to help us identify what's the best time of day for us to visit a particular household. And we will use them to help us count people and to fill in those responses with high-quality data from trusted sources. As I've already said, the use of administrative records will lead to significant cost reductions for the 2020 census. It will allow us to focus our field resources to achieve consistent response rates across geographic areas and demographic groups. So what does this really mean like in terms of our non-response follow-up operation? When we talk about using records, what are we talking about using, and how does that translate into the workload and into the population that we have to count? As a reminder, I've just told you that we estimate through self-response that we'll have about 63.5 self-response before we draw that cut for our non-response follow-up workload, just after 6 weeks. With that assumption, knowing that we believe there will be about 143 million housing units, we believe that there will be just over 56 million housing units that will be qualified for non-response follow-up after 6 weeks of data collection. Just to put it in some sort of comparative perspective for you, the 2010 census had 48 million non-response follow-up visits. Of those 48 million non-response follow-up visits that we did in the 2010 census, 14 million of those visits identified vacant housing units. We knocked on 14 million doors that there was no one there and there was no chance for no one to be there. They were vacant doors. 29 million of those visits were occupied housing units. So stepping back to what we believe 2020 to look like, again, we believe there'll be just over 56 million housing units qualified for non-response, and we'll draw that initial cut for non-response follow-up at that time. At the same time that we're drawing that cut for non-response follow-up, we know that we will get some late self-response trickling in. We know this from our past censuses, we know it from our survey taking. Based on all the information we have, we estimate that while we're preparing for non-response follow-up, an additional 1% of self-responses of addresses will come in late. That's about 1.3 million addresses. Because of technology, we'll be able to remove those 1.3 million addresses from the workload, so we won't have to knock on those doors. Then, at that point in time, we will use administrative records and third-party data to identify vacant housing units, and as a result of our use of the data, remove approximately 11% of the non-response follow-up workload from our universe. That equates to about 6 million addresses that we believe we can identify to be vacant using a combination of administrative records and third-party data. What we will do for those 6 million addresses that we've identified that way is we will send them, and this is where our 6th mailing comes into place, we will send an additional postcard mailing to that address that we've identified to be vacant, just in case someone has moved in or something may have happened. But we will send that additional mailing to that, and we're actually going to test this approach in our 2016 census test. Now, our remaining follow-up universe is down to about 49 million addresses. We will visit all of those addresses once, and we expect by visiting all of those addresses once that we will be able to resolve somewhere between 20 to 25% of those cases at that time. Our models to date, the simulations that we've done in the testing indicate that we can resolve about 22% of them, or about 11 million addresses with just one visit. If we don't obtain an interview at that point in time when we're doing that visit, we'll leave a notice of visit on the door, and we're also going to send that same 6th mailing to this address as well. Again, a last opportunity to self-respond for the unit. At this point in time, after we've knocked on the doors once, after we've sent that 6th reminder mailing to the housing unit, if we have good administrative records and third-party data for these potentially occupied non-responding housing units, we will use that data to enumerate that housing unit. We expect this will happen for about 6 million addresses. This is based on the simulations that we've done using 2010 data as well as our field tests. While all of this work is occurring, we'll continue to get additional self-responses in, and again, we estimate about another 1% of self-response, or another 1.3 million addresses will come in. That then leaves us with a non-response follow-up workload of about 30 million addresses that will require more than 2 visits. And we'll move on from there, and we'll continue to conduct our non-response follow-up. What I'd like to do now is talk about the infrastructure that we're going to use to allow us to conduct this non-response follow-up for all of these units, all of these addresses. We've spent a considerable amount of effort over the last few years looking at how we can re-engineer our field infrastructure and our field operations. Within this innovation area, we're looking to use technology to more efficiently and effectively manage the 2020 census field work. Field workers will use handheld devices for collecting the data. Operations such as recruiting, such as training, such as payroll will be automated, reducing the time and the staff required for these activities. We intend to use new operational control centers that will rely on automation to manage the work, enabling more efficient case management. We're going to determine optimal travel routes for our enumerators to follow. And all of this will lead to a reduction in the number of physical offices that we will need to have for the 2020 census. In general, a streamlined operation and management structure is expected to increase our productivity and save costs for the 2020 census. As we've discussed already, at this point in time when we've already knocked on every door once, and we believe we have about 30 million housing units that will require more than 1 visit. At this point in time, we are testing a variable contact strategy with up to 6 visits, with looking at obtaining a proxy on the 3rd visit. You know, when I started this discussion today, I started by saying that what we do have are all the answers to all the questions that we need to have today. What we don't have are all the answers to all the questions that we need to have for 2020. This is an important place for me to pause and to say that our 2016 census test, one of the primary objectives of this test is finalizing that non-response follow-up methodology, including the final staffing ratios for the enumerators to their supervisors, the contact strategies, whether we're talking about our tailored messaging, or we're talking about the number of visits and the variable contact strategy that we're looking to deploy. So the 2016 census test with that April 1 census day is very important to us in order for us to really lock down and solidify our non-response follow-up methodology. But with all that said, we have made some decisions about what the infrastructure will look like for the 2020 census, and please let me share that with you now. First of all, for the 2020 census, we expect to open 6 regional census centers. This 6 regional census centers compares with the 12 regional census centers that we had in the 2010 census. We believe we will open up to 250 area census offices, as compared with 494 local census offices in 2010. About 30 of these area census offices will open early. The opening of these offices early is really in support of our early operations, including address canvassing, among other things. And when we're looking at non-response follow-up and we're thinking about the number of trained enumerators that we must have to support this large, complex operation, we're looking at needing to hire 300,000 trained enumerators as compared with the 600,000 trained enumerators in 2010. And with that said, that brings us through a discussion of the 4 innovation areas, and it allows us to bring the census all together at a very high level. One piece that I did not share with you all as we were doing it is that the operational plan that we're releasing today, that will be available on the internet, really speaks to the 34 operations of the census, and Deirdre's going to talk about this. But this is just one of the operational plans. What we're talking about today is the high-level plan for the census. Each of the 34 operations of the census will have a detailed operational plan of similar length and detail as what you'll see today. And with that, what I'd like to do is pause and turn it over to Deirdre, who's going to walk us through the plan itself, as well as some of the operations. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all of your smiling faces out there. Lisa just did a great job of sharing the major design decisions for the 2020 census, especially as they relate to our 4 key innovation areas. Those decisions were not made lightly. They were data-driven, and they resulted from years of our research and testing program. You'll recall that from 2012 through 2015, we focused on developing, researching, and testing our key innovation areas. We conducted several tests: the 2012 National Census Test, the 2013 National Census Contact Test, the 2013 Census Test, and the 2014 Census Test. We went out and conducted LUCA focus groups with our partners interested in participating in the local update of census addresses. We conducted a 2014 Human in the Loop simulation, the 2015 Address Validation Test, the 2015 Optimizing Self-Response Test, and finally the 2015 Census Test. As we were conducting all of those tests, we were preparing to release our 2020 Census Operational Plan. Over the past year, as we worked to finalize our operational plan, we refined our concept of operations for the innovation areas, and we outlined the other operations that are essential for conducting a successful census. This slide presents a graphic representation of the 34 operations that are needed to conduct a successful 2020 census. The operations are organized into 7 major areas that correspond with the 2020 census work breakdown structure: program management, census and survey engineering, frame, response data, published data, test and evaluation, and infrastructure. In this graphic, program management, census and survey engineering, and infrastructure are combined into one general group called support, which is shown at the top of the diagram. Also, the legend at the bottom shows that for many of these operations, highlighted in dark green, detailed planning is well underway. For others, detailed planning has recently begun, and for a few others, detailed planning has not yet started. Moving forward, I'm happy to say that the 2020 census program will ensure that scope definition, cost estimation, budget formulation and execution, and schedule development and management will be conducted using these categories to organize our work. These 34 operations shown on this slide today are described in our operational plan. As Lisa said, it's important to mention that for each of these operations moving forward, we're going to create a more detailed operational plan, drilling down and detailing the way we will implement these operations. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes reviewing the major design decisions in a little bit of a different format. Some of these Lisa reviewed in detail, others I will share with you for the first time. Recognizing that not everyone in the room lives and breathes census the way we do, we thought it would be important to reiterate several of the decisions. As you'll remember from the infographic, first, we establish where to count. Lisa mentioned that the address canvassing operation will consist of 3 major components: in-office address canvassing, in-field address canvassing, and the MAF coverage study. All will be infused with quality. In-office address canvassing will be conducted for 100% of the housing units. This work will establish the workload for in-field address canvassing, which will be conducted for 25% of the housing units. The number of area census offices used to support address canvassing will be reduced from 151 in the 2010 census to approximately 30 in the 2020 census. The crew leader assistant position will be removed from the staffing structure for in-field address canvassing due to the increased efficiencies we're seeing from the use of automation. During prior censuses, this position served primarily as a courier, shuffling paper between the enumerators and the crew leaders. Administrative records and third-party data sources will be used to validate addresses within each census bureau, in each census block. And this work has already started with production in-office address canvassing, which began in September of this year, as Lisa mentioned, at our National Processing Center. Next, we move on to motivating people to respond or to self-respond. We estimate that through the use of an integrated communications and partnership campaign, one that uses digital advertising and social media and includes various ways to contact the population, we can communicate the importance of the 2020 census to the U.S. population and encourage self-response. As Lisa mentioned, we estimate that after 6 weeks, the self-response rate will be 63.5%. Again, 6 weeks is important because that's when we make the cut and create the non-response follow-up universe. We will offer an internet self-response option in languages other than English and Spanish, including those with non-Roman alphabets. We estimate that after 6 weeks, internet response will come in at 47%. We will also offer census questionnaire assistance with the ability for our respondents to complete interviews over the telephone with agents, and we estimate the response rate via this mode will be 5.3% after 6 weeks. We will also provide a paper option for those to respond who are not interested in responding via the internet or with an agent, and we expect that this will result in a response rate of 11.2% after 6 weeks. Again, it's important to mention that we will send paper questionnaires to 20% of all housing units during the first mailing, and we will send paper questionnaires to non-responding housing units. We'll make that cut after 2 weeks of self-response. As Lisa mentioned, we will offer the ability to conduct non-ID processing here at the Census Bureau. Respondents will be offered the opportunity to respond either with or without a unique census identification code. And another important thing to mention, as we've talked about in previous PMRs, we will not offer a formal Notify Me option as a result of our findings in the 2014 and 2015 census tests. Once we complete the self-response portion of the 2020 census, we must continue to count the population, specifically those that have not yet responded. Recall that after 6 weeks, we'll make the cut for our non-response follow-up universe. This will be approximately 56 million housing units that have not responded. We'll use administrative records and third-party data to identify vacant housing units and remove approximately 11% of those housing units from the non-response follow-up workload. We will then visit non-responding housing units at least once. As Lisa mentioned, we expect to remove approximately 20 to 25% of the remaining non-response follow-up housing units through this visit. We'll use administrative records and third-party data to enumerate the non-responding housing units for which we have good administrative record data, and we'll remove approximately 16.5% of the remaining non-response follow-up universe at that point. It's also important to mention that we will use administrative records and third-party data to re-engineer operations of the past, the vacant delete operation and our coverage follow-up operations. We'll also conduct coverage improvement operations as part of the non-response follow-up effort and as part of motivating people to respond. We'll provide dedicated resources for unique populations, such as those with limited English proficiency, demographically diverse populations, and the hard to count. To complete the workload, we'll utilize a re-engineered field management and staffing structure due to the increased efficiencies we're seeing from the use of automation and technology. We will change the ratio of production enumerators to census field supervisors from 8 to 1 in the 2010 census to approximately 15 to 1 in the 2020 census. Again, like address canvassing, during the non-response follow-up operation, we'll remove crew leader assistance from the picture. We'll reduce the number of trained enumerators by approximately 50%, from 600,000 trained enumerators in the 2010 census to 300,000 in 2020. And finally, the non-response follow operation will consist of both production and quality assurance components. We will also conduct group quarters operations, which will allow individuals to self-respond and self-identify the group quarter type for which they reside. As Lisa mentioned, we'll conduct census questionnaire assistance. We'll allow respondents to communicate with our agents not only over the telephone, but through web chat and through email. However, we will not use these modes to collect questionnaire interviews. Additionally, we will not use text messaging as a data collection mode. Finally, because of the complexity of our country and our operations, we will require a large infrastructure. As Lisa mentioned, and as I'd like to reiterate, we will move from 12 regional census centers, as we used in 2010, to 6 regional census offices to support the 2020 census. We'll include up to 250 area census offices, as opposed to the 494 that we used in 2010. We'll reduce the number of training hours required for both our address canvassing and our non-response follow-up operations. For address canvassing, we'll reduce training hours from 35 to 28 in 2020, and from 44 hours in 2010 to 28 in 2020. It is important to mention that we'll continue testing the appropriate number of training hours and the amount of online versus in-person training as we conduct the 2016 census test. The training pay rate for address canvassing and non-response follow-up, both for enumerators and census field supervisors, will be $1.50 lower than the production rate. Another important thing to mention, the 2020 census will have 2 paper data capture centers. This is workload driven and differs from the 2010 census, in which we opened 3 paper data capture centers. Whenever technically feasible and cost-effective, the 2020 census will use enterprise solutions to help in processing and collecting and tabulating the data. For example, we'll use iCADE, the Integrated Capture and Data Entry System for the 2020 census, which is currently being used for several of our surveys here at the Census Bureau. And finally, as related to infrastructure, we will use a hybrid cloud design for scaling our enterprise systems when needed. And of course, we must not only collect the data, but we must process it, tabulate, and release the census data no later than December 31st of 2020, a few short months from Census Day of April 1st. It's important to mention that the tabulated 2020 census data will be available to the public through the Census Bureau's Center for Enterprise Dissemination and Consumer Service Innovation, and you've heard this referred to as CEDSI, many of you. The next slide presents a pictorial version of our 2020 census life cycle schedule. It includes program-level milestones, such as deliver topics to Congress by April of 2017, deliver questions to Congress by April of 2018. Census Day in 2020 will be April 1st, 2020. The schedule includes key decision points, such as when we begin opening our regional census centers in December of 2017, and when we'll award significant contracts, such as the Census Questionnaire Assistance Contract and our Communications Contract. This diagram presents the schedule at the highest level. We have a very detailed schedule within our program with over 9,000 lines that are supported by over a dozen certified schedulers. Lastly, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the risks that are very significant for the 2020 census program. The following slides will share some of our selected risks that represent the major concerns that could affect the design or successful implementation of the 2020 census program. Our first risk is to execute a 2020 census that reduces cost while maintaining quality. The Census Bureau requires appropriate funding for the entire life cycle. If the funding appropriated for each fiscal year during the 2020 census life cycle is less than requested or not provided at the start of each fiscal year, then the Census Bureau will have to reprioritize our projects, which may affect our ability to re-engineer our operations and systems supporting the 2020 census. In order to mitigate some of these risks, we plan to formulate and submit robust cost estimates for the planned 2020 census activities per fiscal year. We plan to develop strong budget justifications that demonstrate the negative impact of insufficient funds for the 2020 census activities per fiscal year. We plan to prioritize our research, testing, and implementation activities by fiscal year on those areas that can significantly impact cost and quality, and develop contingency plans to quickly respond to budget cuts. The second risk I'd like to mention is the Census Bureau is planning to use administrative records and third-party data to reduce the need to follow up with non-respondents through the identification of vacant housing units and the enumeration of non-responding housing units. If external factors or policies prevent the Census Bureau from using administrative records and third-party data as planned, then the Census Bureau may not be able to fully meet our strategic goal of containing the overall cost of the 2020 census. In order to mitigate this risk, we're identifying our external stakeholders that have an interest in Census Bureau policies regarding administrative records and third-party data usage. We're developing a communications plan for our identified external stakeholders. We're regularly communicating and seeking feedback from our stakeholders through venues such as this, the program management reviews. We're assessing any impacts of changes to our design based on feedback that we're hearing, and we're monitoring very carefully external factors and policies that may affect our planned use of administrative records during the 2020 census. The third risk I'd like to share today is that the accuracy and the usefulness of the data collected for the 2020 census is dependent upon our ability to obtain information from the public, which is influenced partly by the public's perception of how well their privacy and their confidentiality concerns are being addressed. If a substantial segment of the population is not convinced that the Census Bureau can safeguard their data against data breaches and unauthorized uses, then the response rates may be lower than we've projected, that 63.5% self-response rate, thereby leading to an increase in non-response follow-up cases and an increase in our costs. In order to mitigate this risk, we're developing a communication strategy to build and maintain the public's confidence in the Census Bureau's ability to keep their data safe. We're researching the way other Census Bureau divisions, other government agencies, and the private sector to understand how they effectively mitigate the issue of public trust and IT security. We're continually monitoring the public's confidence in data security in order to stay abreast of their possible and probable acceptance of our methods for enumeration. Our fourth important risk is security breaches could happen to the Census Bureau's Internet Data Collection Instrument, to our mobile devices that we use for field work, and to data processing and storage systems. IT systems and security controls will be put in place to block attempts from outside infiltration, as well as to prevent any negative impacts to services or data, such as network disruption, technical malfunctions, or stolen or corrupted data. If a cybersecurity incident, such as a breach, were to occur to the systems or the devices being used for the 2020 census, then additional technological efforts will be required to repair or replace the systems and the devices affected in order to maintain secure services and data. The mitigation strategies for this risk are to monitor system development efforts to ensure the property security guidelines are followed during the system development phase, to research other Census Bureau programs, other government agencies, and the private sector to understand how they effectively mitigate cybersecurity risks, to audit our systems and to frequently check our logs to help in detecting and tracing an outside infiltration, to contract with third-party testers to perform threat and vulnerability analyses, and finally to prepare for rapid response to address any detected cybersecurity incidents. I'd now like to move from our red risks and share two more of our risks, which are currently yellow. And I'll build on that as we have the discussion. Our fifth risk that we'd like to discuss is centered around the notion that new technological innovations surface frequently. The smartphone of today may not look like the smartphone of tomorrow. However, the 2020 census program must move forward toward building our baseline and our operational design, which will be finalized and put into production for the 2018 end-to-end test. And please recall, We have immovable and unforgiving deadlines. We have to deliver the data to the president by December 31st of 2020, and we have to deliver the redistricting data to the states no later than March 31st of 2021. If technical innovations are to surface after the design of the 2020 census has been finalized, then development and testing of our life cycle phases must be compressed if those innovations are to be adopted, resulting in less time to mature innovations in census methods and systems. It's important to note here that the closer it is to the start of the 2020 census, the higher the impact of late operational design changes and changes to technology. Thus, while currently yellow, this risk has the potential and will become red as it becomes later in the decade. In order to mitigate this risk, we're going to build versatile operations and systems that are flexible. We're going to keep our team members and management aware of evolving technical innovations. We're devoting dedicated resources to track and communicate innovations, and we're dedicating funds to incorporate new innovations into our design. Our final risk is that after key planning and development milestones are completed, stakeholders may disagree with the planned innovations behind the 2020 census and decide to modify the design, resulting in late operational design changes, and we are hoping this does not happen. If those operational design changes are required, following the completion of our key planning and development milestones, and specifically the 2018 end-to-end test, then the 2020 census program may have to implement costly design changes, increasing the risk for a timely and successful 2020 census and significantly increasing the likelihood of increased costs. Again, it's important to note that as we approach the 2020 census, this risk will move from yellow to red. In order to mitigate our risks for this category, we have identified our external stakeholders that have an interest in the 2020 program. Many of you are sitting at the tables today. We've developed a stakeholder communications plan for these identified stakeholders and working and communicating with you. We're regularly communicating to and seeking feedback from you in order to learn more about our design decisions and our research and testing. We're assessing any impacts of our changes to the design based on the feedback we receive and updating our plans accordingly. And again, we're monitoring external factors and policies that may impact the design of the 2020 census. Lisa started with the bottom line, and I'm going to end with it. We have developed a comprehensive design for the 2020 census. Our cost estimates are based on that design using best practices for cost estimation. Our cost estimates assume that the 2020 census will receive the funding that we've requested. With that said, I'd like to say again, we estimate that the cost of the 2020 census using our new design will be $12.5 billion, avoiding $5.2 billion in costs as compared with using the same methodologies that we used in 2010 for the 2020 census. We thank you for your attention today, and now I'd like to turn it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Deirdre. I think what we'd like to do now is pause. We have about a half hour for questions and discussion. I've never known this group to be quiet. Tricia.
Tricia Durr from the Office of Inspector General. Thank you for sharing your bullets of your decision points, and your the decision-making process is, I'm sure, very difficult, and there's a lot to take in and absorb, and I think there's a lot under the hood that we could be here for days trying to absorb and learn about. So I guess I'm going to have to ask, first of all, about the risk of the administrative records being read. What has led you thus far to make it red?
And actually, before I start with that, I was remiss in something, so bear with me for 1 second. I actually, and then I'll turn to your question, which I won't forget, I promise. I actually wanted to point out the rest of the panel that we have up here for the discussion piece. We have Evan, who's our program manager over our address canvassing operation. I'm simplifying it. Mary Ann over non-response follow-up. Tasha's here to speak to communications and our integrated partnership plans, and Mike Bentley for our self-response program. So I was remiss in not introducing the rest of the panel for this portion, and I apologize for that to my fellow discussants. Thank you. So in terms of the administrative records, I think right now the calculation of the colors, it's a nominal exercise that we go through when we're ranking it, but there are a number of factors at play when we look at our ability to utilize administrative records. And I know we've talked about this on a number of occasions, but up until we've had the design for the 2020 census, we haven't had the information that we've needed to have an informed and educated conversation with our stakeholders. And that, I think, is what really allows us to lay the foundation today for where we need to go for the future. And having the test data that we needed from the 14 test, from the 15 test, the results of the analysis that we're conducting on the evaluation follow-up to best understand how the characteristics might be different so we can have those informed conversations. The use of administrative records, as we talked about it, is a significant component for our ability to reduce the workload, the non-response follow-up workload. And as such, it's a significant cost driver for us in helping us reduce the overarching costs of the census. All of those factors play into the score that this particular item was given in our risk register. Other questions? Ben?
Can you talk about some of the biggest decisions you cannot make today? And sort of what steps or what tests are going to lead to those decisions being made?
Sure, it's a great question. To me, the largest decision that we have yet to make in terms of the design of the census is that overarching methodology for non-response follow-up. What will the number of attempts be? What will the order of attempts be? When will proxy interviews come into place? How will that vary for group quarters versus housing units? What all those factors are that we still have to decide, which is why the 2016 test is so critical. The next piece behind that, in my perspective, is our ability to successfully implement address canvassing. And for that, for our re-engineered address canvassing, the notion of going from an in-office canvassing, which we are doing, and then having us do the in-field verification for 25%. We know we can actualize that. We know that the procedures will work. What we don't yet understand, because we haven't had an opportunity to test it, and our 2016 address canvassing test will lay the foundation for us for that, is what the interaction effects are when we bring the various operations together. And to me, those are some of the largest decisions that we still have to play. Also, of course, some of the things we have to do, we're moving, as always, from proof of concept systems or prototype systems into production systems. I know we've talked quite a bit about that over the last couple of years, and one of the mitigations we have to that is our layering of the systems with each and every test, where we're moving each system from its early phases into its next phase and scaling it as appropriate as we move forward. But we are still in the medium stages, so to speak, of where we are in that development life cycle. If you'll remember from sort of the welcome slide, my last slide laid out the major milestones for fiscal year 16, and at the bottom of that slide there was a graph, a bar, that showed the timeline for the 2020 census, moving from red into a lighter gradation of blue, into a darker gradation of blue, and of course you're looking at it in black and white, so it's not very helpful. But if you remember it from the screen, what that image was trying to convey really were, at its simplest level, the three components of the phases for our execution. Moving from research and testing into operational design and development where we are today, into the execution with the start of the 18 end-to-end test. I could keep going, but that's probably sufficient for now. Other questions?
Hi, Ty Mitchell from Government Accountability Office. Thank you. I knew if I waited, someone might ask a similar question, but just following up on some of the other decisions out there. The EdCan starts in production soon, and the MAF coverage area study, if if I said that right, the math coverage study seems to play a very prominent role from here on out. And I was interested, and I think you touched on this a little bit, if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the decisions that coverage study is meant to specifically inform. I mean, I'm just trying to, it seems like a kind of a catch-all for a lot of things that need to get figured out, and if just some specific examples of really what that's going to nail down for you.
So Ty, I think the intent of the MAF coverage study is to do, as you alluded, a number of things. One is to help us understand the coverage, over coverage and under coverage in the MAF. The second thing is to take, to give us an opportunity to collect some data in the field to help us understand how well our in-office Canvas process is actually working. So we began executing that a couple of weeks ago, and we'll continue that throughout the census lifecycle. But we need to capture some metrics that help us understand whether or not the work that we're doing in the office is actually working as intended. And then the third thing that I view the MAF coverage study is giving us an opportunity to do is since it is a field data collection operation of 20,000 blocks nationwide, roughly 1 million addresses a year, we're actually able to take the technology that we're using to collect data in the field and make some modifications to it to help improve the process. So again, I think there are three distinct and important facets of the MAF coverage study, again, to help us understand how well or some opportunities for improvement that the in-office canvassing process is bringing. The second is to help us understand the coverage from an over coverage and under coverage in the MAF. And then the third thing is to give us an opportunity to test new field data collection procedures.
Thank you. That's helpful. On that second point, I guess I just want to make sure I'm understanding what the decision is that's been made regarding the role of the relative scale of in-house versus in-field. If one of those major objectives over the next few years is to learn how well that in-house is doing, I mean, is it conceivable it's not doing what you want and those ratios are changing based on the MAF coverage study?
I suppose that's possible, that the 25% in-field that we intend to collect in 2020 that number is moving. But I think that what the in-office canvassing and the MAF coverage study allows us to do combined is to continue to refine those processes to get us to that 25% figure.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions. I'm happy to yield if there's other hands going up. I'm impressed by the statement of allowing everybody the chance to self-response. I mean, that's powerful, you know, this census participatory. I'm curious when that moves to folks in group quarters, and I know there's still some decisions or some things to be ironed out in that area, but is there any elaboration you can offer on the thinking that's already been done on how that plays out? If you're in a group quarter and traditionally you weren't being given that opportunity, I mean, this just has the potential to have a large increase in the unduplication that maybe has to take place. I'm just, if there's more thinking on how that's going to play out, just because a large number of group quarters headcount.
So operationally, we are looking at group quarters. We've looked back at 2010 and we've asked ourselves, what are the opportunities for improvement? What are the different modes that we could use to engage the group quarter respondent? So certainly self-response is one of them. We intend to, and actually we've put a survey out to 259 group quarters organizations to find out what types of data do they have, what is the data format, are they willing to share this data with us? So we're anticipating having the opportunity to use data that already exists to help build the frame and potentially enumerate the population. We certainly will continue our research and testing around new methodologies or new opportunities to innovate. One of those that is actually going to a governance board tomorrow is the use of basically an automated instrument that allows us to eliminate the paper aspect of some portion of group quarters enumeration. Does that give you some sense of where we're going.
That's all useful. Just to clarify, the survey, people giving you the 259, giving you their own data, kind of that canvassing that you're doing, is that analogous with self-response when a GQ gives you the numbers? That's not the same thing, is it?
No.
Okay.
Okay, other questions? Okay, Dan?
Hi, Dan Cork, National Academies. Ty took my group quarters question, so I think I've got two. The first one is that you mentioned that coverage improvement operations will be included, and then there's the decision point where you mentioned that administrative records and third-party data will be used to re-engineer coverage follow-up and vacant delete operations. But coverage improvement doesn't show up on that bubble chart of the main list of operations. It doesn't, a coverage follow-up operation of the same nature as in 2010 doesn't seem to be a natural sub-item of non-response operations, and telephone questionnaire assistance is described so far as being a purely inbound calling operation. So the question is, do these cost estimates reflect a largish scale outbound calling operation of the sort of a coverage improvement, a coverage follow-up?
So there's a lot of questions in 2 questions. I'm thinking there's like 10 in there. So let me try to
There's
parse.
context about one question.
Let me try to parse them apart, and I'll start with some. I have a feeling Deirdre will pick up some, and I suspect Marianne will chime in as well. Let me start with the outbound calls at a minimum. At this point in time, we're looking to do outbound calling through a combination of ways. Certainly, outbound calling may be within scope of our Census questionnaire assistance contract. We're also in deep conversations with our national processing centers and looking at what our outbound operations might be there. So these are some of the decisions that will be part as we move forward with our Census questionnaire assistance contract and as we build out our operations around it. But we haven't neglected outbound calls. We're just handling them in a slightly different way from the context of the conversations we're having today. We do expect outbound calls to be some portion of a quality re-interview, and I suspect Marianne can talk more about that.
When we think about the re-interview, when we think about the non-response follow-up operation, we are considering having an outbound calling to support the non-response follow-up re-interview. And this is primarily as a function of checking back with respondents with regard to an enumerator's visit to their household to try to collect their data. In addition, we are considering outbound calling as a matter of a coverage re-interview, perhaps more similar to what you would think of with the 2010 census coverage follow-up that may be checking.
Right, but that would apply to the internet responses and the mail questionnaire quality checks, things that failed edits or large households or whatever come in that way, as opposed to just purely quality control on the NRFU interviewing.
Correct. Did we answer your questions, or did you have other components to it?
That's the main one. So it's built in potentially as part of a couple of the operations, but not as a sole one in there. But so the cost estimates do reflect some notion of outbound. It's not a complete unknown at this point. The next question is just one of the decision points you mentioned, administrative records and third-party data sources will be used to validate addresses within each block. And early on, Lisa used as the example of the case where you would go from in-office review to in-field as being something that looks like a multi-unit or something that looks like a conversion. Just to be clear, is the use of administrative records and third-party data also part of something you'd be doing in in-office review, looking at address lists that come out as a byproduct of the administrative records results as a first check before you send someone into the field to look at it?
So, Evan, wait 1 second. So there are several components of this, and it's a question that we get asked often. It's a good one, Dan, and I appreciate it. So to be clear, it's not just the use of aerial imagery, it's the aerial imagery in combination with administrative and third-party data sources that would be additional verifications for us before we would send something out. We also see it as an ongoing process. So just because we've done in-office review of a particular area once, it doesn't mean that it may not be suspect for doing it a second or a third time, depending on what we see and what the data are showing us prior to heading out to infield.
Those are the magic words. Thank you.
Other questions? This is what happens when we move to the afternoon. We should do this more often. It's very exciting. I don't know if we have anyone in the overflow room. Do we have anyone in the overflow room? Okay, a couple people, but no questions. Oh, thank you, overflow room. Any other questions from the audience? Ty? Ty, sorry, I missed you.
Sorry, I was trying to yield. Just as a quick question, Marianne, on the coverage re-interview, is that part of the NERFU? I'm looking at the operations, and I know SIFU kind of disappeared during the prior cost model as one of the potential cost savings, and you mentioned the coverage re-interview. Is that something that would be embedded kind of in the NERFU box? Is that kind of where that consideration is taking place?
Well, that's a great question. I'd say right now, yes, we're considering it as part of non-response follow-up. It doesn't exist as a box in and of itself at this point in time. We will continue to research in the next few years to try to understand what the magnitude of a need for a sort of coverage re-interview would be. I don't know if at some point that would then necessitate us calling it its own operation. So I reserve the right to maybe change our mind at some point in time and call it a separate operation.
No, fair enough. I didn't see it on it. I'm just curious where the thinking was placed on the chart. That's helpful. And then I noticed on slide 13, when we're talking about the 22.5% of the workload resolved with one visit, just that word resolved, sometimes we say we're getting responses. Is 22.5%, is that what we're assuming people are going to respond based on your experience, or does that include proxies, for example?
It didn't, I don't believe it included proxies. It was based on the data we have, the number of responses with one visit. Other questions? Oh, right there. Oh, Ben, hi.
Following up on my last question, could you talk a little bit about the decision around the provision of devices? I noticed that was missing at present.
Sure, this is one of my favorite topics. And I do mean that. So as many of you know, over the last few years, we've been looking into the possibility, and we still are researching the possibility of a bring your own device for the 2020 census. We tested a very, very small test in the 2014 test. I think it was with 9 people around bring your own device. And then in the 2015 test, we had a much larger test where we actually set aside part of the sample to go out and do actual enumeration, non-response follow-up using bring your own device as the primary way to supply equipment. As part of that 2015 test, that went very well. There were a few glitches. We did, as part of it, identify a wait list of devices that people could bring to participate. We had a few people show up with devices that weren't compliant with what we had expected them to do, things of that nature. But the test itself did go well. Qualitatively, we didn't hear anything of pushback from the respondents about an enumerator showing up with their own device as opposed to a government-furnished equipment. With all of that said as background, one of the things we will be testing in the 2016 test are 3 alternatives, or 3 different approaches to the procurement, to the provisioning of devices. One would be some aspect of government-furnished equipment. The second would be continued testing in a bring-your-own-device fashion. And the third would be a new alternative that we're looking to test and to deploy, which is device as a service. And this is where we would go through a contracted solution in lieu of bring-your-own-device, where a vendor would be responsible for providing the device. We believe that that kind of solution, based on some research we've done, can help us achieve some of the cost savings that we would have acquired through bring-your-own-device without, and mitigating some of the potential risks. But until we complete the census test, the 2016 census test, we won't have more information about that. But it's a great question. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, if there aren't other questions, I'd just like to do one more thing before we take our break. We're a few minutes early. So I started this session with a series of acknowledgements, and I'd like to do this, and thanks, and I'd like to do the same at the end of the session, but I'd like to start by thanking a different group and acknowledging a different group of people. As I said early on, the development of the operational plan, the development of the design of the census, it's not done by one person, it's not done by two people, it's not even done by 3 or 5 or 20 people. It's a collective effort of hundreds of people within the Census Bureau and our stakeholders in pulling together the plan for what the census will look like. It was a pretty monumental undertaking for us. All of the research and testing we've done to date, the conversations with our stakeholders, the ability to very quickly understand and analyze the data, while at the same time working on the next test and the test thereafter and the plans for the 2020 census. So what I'd like to do is to stop and thank those people that have been involved and that have given so much already to the design of the census for the work we have done. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the operational plan team. I know that there are many, many people that worked on this, but we did have a core group of about a dozen people that spent considerable effort on this, led by Ann Wittenauer, who's over in the corner over there. Thank you, Ann. I don't know if there's other members of the team in the audience. I know Harry's here. He was also on that team. If they could stand so we could thank them for their efforts, I would appreciate it. Bob. In addition to the operational plan team, while we had representatives from each of the program areas working on consolidating all the research and testing so we could have a robust design from the census, there were hundreds of people working throughout the Census Bureau and continuing to work throughout the Census Bureau on the individual project teams or at our National Processing Center or in our regions on the conduct of the test. For those staff that are in the room that have been working on the 2020 census, if they could please stand and remain standing, I have one other piece I'd like to do. But those of our staff that have been working on it, I would appreciate it so we could thank you as well. And while they're standing, thank you, Frank. Thanks, guys. Thank you. And lastly, you know, the staff that are standing now are the staff that are still so integral to our program. This program is a living document. It's one that started back in 2012. It's one that we've worked on over the years. And we all know with any day, with any effort we put in, that there are staff that join our program and there are staff that move on for new opportunities. I'm very pleased today that there were so many of the staff that have been part of working on the design for the 2020 census that came back today to support us. I see a number of them in the room. If they could please stand as well, we'd like to acknowledge and thank you for your efforts. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone one last time. I appreciate all of your interest in the design. I look forward to the forthcoming discussions that I know we're going to have, and I look forward to a very successful implementation of the 2020 census. So thank you all, and I think we'll go to a quick break. I have to tell you when to be back. Let's be back in 15 minutes.